Boone and Crockett Country, presented by Loophole.
The public trust doctrine is the pillar of wildlife conservation and management in North America. It is a principle anchored by a U.S. Supreme Court decision that upheld the American ideal that wildlife belongs to the public. It provides that certain resources are preserved for public use, and that government is required to maintain these resources for public use. The most prevalent examples of this doctrine are within wildlife and fisheries management. Government in these examples is almost entirely that of state government. The result of this state management has been the recovery in wildlife from vanishing to flourishing and the wealth of hunting, fishing, and outdoors opportunities we all enjoy today. State management is working when allowed to work. Throughout history, there have been only a few instances, out of circumstance or necessity, where the federal government has superseded the management authority of state government. In the majority of these instances, a positive result for man and wildlife was achieved. In one instance, however, federal law has emphasized the security of one species at the expense of other species and man, this being the 1973 Endangered Species Act, or ESA. With game species flourishing in the hands of the states and sportsmen, some non-game species began to need similar attention. Under the ESA, once the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service listed a species as endangered or threatened, the federal government assumes total control over that species to the exclusion of the state's authority. This in itself is not the bigger issue. The question is, can laws intended for the greater good swing the pendulum too far in the opposite direction? In most cases, the balancing act between state and federal management authority has been successful in conserving and managing our wildlife resources. Such cooperation is necessary for many reasons. One reason is that sportsmen pay for nearly all of these programs through excise taxes, which are collected by the federal government and then distributed to individual states. But these monies are directed to the management of game species and their habitats. No one can argue against the need for the protection of certain species of mammals, birds, and fish. This is likely why this act has gone unchallenged for over 30 years. Who does not take pride in seeing the once threatened symbol of our nation, the bald eagle, or the mating dance of the sage-grouse? These are but two of the conservation success stories spun out of the federal government stepping in for wildlife. As we will learn, not all laws work as intended in all instances, and continuing to usurp state authority in managing its wildlife can create more problems than the law was intended to solve. Problems that affect ranchers, farmers, other citizens, and every hunter, angler, and trapper, no matter where they live.
Insights presented by Loophole, America's Optics Authority.
There are a lot of ways to maximize accuracy and reliability in the field, but a mounting system is typically the last thing we think about, if at all. Hi, I'm Tim Lesser. You might be surprised by how many common accuracy issues can be resolved with a good, adjustable base and ring system. Modern rifle scopes have windage and elevation adjustments that allow you to change the point of impact without physically moving the scope on top of the rifle. This is accomplished by moving the erector system inside the main tube of the scope. But there's a limited amount of travel available before this erector system gets pinned against the main tube, which because of recoil can decrease the life of the scope. An adjustable base lets you make gross corrections with the mounts and save the scope's internal adjustments for fine-tuning. This leaves plenty of room for the erector springs to absorb recoil, provide long scope life, and maximum accuracy.
Optical Insights has been brought to you by Loophole, America's Optics Authority. Boone and Crockett Country is in partnership with The Wild Sheep Foundation, putting and keeping sheep on the mountain. Remington Arms and Ammunition, welcome to Remington Country. And the Dallas Safari Club, promoting conservation and ethical hunting worldwide.
When America was founded, the states reserved for themselves, under the U.S. Constitution, total authority and control over the resident fish and wildlife within each of their sovereign boundaries. The diversity of ecosystems, wildlife, and local traditions demanded a more tailored system at state level versus at the federal level. The results are undeniable. Over the past century, game and fish populations as a whole have gone from dismal to robust, but this mainly applies to game species, under the blanket of protection provided by sportsmen. Along with these successes in conservation and game management, there became a need to address situations with some non-game species, and thus Congress passed the Endangered Species Act in 1973. Spun out of the good intentions of this legislation, there have developed issues of lasting consequence, both in negative effects to other wildlife and man. The most noticeable of these today is the gray wolf. Of all the protected species, the gray wolf has been the most controversial and polarizing. Our society systematically removed wolves in the early days of our nation because they killed the animals man cared about, wild and domestic. Wolves that were finding their way into the United States from Canada were protected under the Endangered Species Act in the lower 48 states in 1974. Under provisions in the ESA, U.S. Fish and Wildlife must submit a recovery plan for listed species that includes sustainability beyond recovery before a species can be removed from federal protection.
By law, the Fish and Wildlife Service is required to develop plans to recover endangered species. In 1987, we developed a plan to recover wolf populations. In 1992, Congress mandated that we develop plans to look at reintroducing wolves to Yellowstone and central Idaho. We did that over the next 2 years, and finally, in 1995, we reintroduced wolves to both of those areas.
Once a scientific plan has been drafted and approved, it is still the responsibility of the federal government to see that the plan is executed until recovery and sustainability are achieved and delisting can occur.
In the early 90s, Congress mandated that we look at the potential effect of wolf recovery and what wolf recovery would look like. And so we did a tremendous amount of scientific review on what a recovered wolf population would look like. We determined that a wolf population that never went below 300 wolves and 30 breeding pair, which is essentially a pack that successfully breeds, would be one that would be viable, would never be threatened or endangered, and that would represent wolf recovery under the Endangered Species Act.
Under the ESA, once recovery of a species has been achieved, future management authority is then turned over to the states to manage in concert with their other wildlife programs. This is the exit strategy as written, but this is not what is being followed.
At the end of 2009, there were at least 1,700 wolves in the Northern Rockies, and that would be Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, and the population has expanded towards eastern Oregon and eastern Washington into the south towards northern Colorado and northern Utah. That is clearly exceeding the biological recovery criteria that were established, and this population has been exceeding that recovery criteria since 2002. The delay in delisting has been largely due to the fact of litigation, tying up the federal decision-making in court, and delaying that transition to state management.
State management would include the fair chase hunting of wolves and other lethal and non-lethal methods to lessen wolf impact on livestock and big game species, while keeping wolf populations within sustainable guidelines mandated by the Endangered Species Act. The holdup to state management has been that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has been dragged in and out of court over one objection after another by groups like the Defenders of Wildlife and the Humane Society, both proclaimed animal rights and anti-hunting groups.
This issue has been in and out of court for the last 16 years, since the mid-1990s. And it's really important to know that when it comes to wolves, it's really about people debating other people. It's not about real wolves on the ground. doing what they do ecologically or getting involved with conflicts with livestock. It's really about people and their value systems and people debating people. It's also not really about science. The science is very clear. Population is clearly recovered, it's robust, it's healthy, it's doing just fine. Some folks just don't want to see wolves killed. They just don't want to see wolves managed in concert with other wildlife on the ground to try to maintain that balance between all wildlife species and the habitats in which they live.
The greatest concern now to sportsmen and livestock growers is that while being held up in court, wolf numbers have been increasing, along with livestock losses, and deer, elk, and moose populations have been decreasing.
One of the most frustrating parts about this whole scenario is you've got these animal rights groups and these environmental groups that are manipulating the Endangered Species Act far beyond what it was ever intended for. And all it takes is a lawyer to go file in court, and they keep moving the goal line and moving the goal line and extending out the process. In the meantime, we've got more and more wolves on the ground, and it's like a built-in amnesty program for wolves. It's going to take us years to recover our elk herds from where they once were, or even anywhere close to it, even if the wolf stopped dead today. And nobody is suggesting that.
Today, there are over 1,700 wolves in the reintroduction states of Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. This sounds like a real conservation success story, but all is not what it seems.
Boone and Crockett Country is in partnership with Buck Knives, knives that fit your life, and the Pope and Young Club, for the good of bow hunting.
Why should more wolves than the Endangered Species Act recovery plan call for concern sportsmen? The answer is simple. Wolves eat the surplus of managed big game species that for decades have been allocated to sportsmen. The fact is, wolves are an alpha predator released into a food-rich landscape created by sportsmen's dollars and the livestock industry. Everyone thought that wolves would only be brought back to a population level determined by science and approved by the federal government. The real story is in how we got to 5 times as many wolves and how others are using the Endangered Species Act to block state management and profit financially in the process. There is something else in play here other than a concern for wolves: dollars. Wolf litigation is a fundraiser and a profit center for activist groups. Nothing raises money better than a good crisis, and these groups are experts at using wildlife to get their constituents to write checks. The real tipping point is not in elective contributions to a cause, but in taxpayer-funded lawsuits.
There are provisions in the Endangered Species Act, like the citizen suit provision, and there's also the Equal Access to Justice Act, that allow these environmental and these animal rights groups to apply for reimbursement of their legal fees. The money that comes out of the judgment fund for such reimbursements literally comes out of as a line item from these other government agencies like the Forest Service or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. So it's a double hit for the taxpayers, because that money is therefore not going towards managing wildlife as it was originally intended. It's paying their legal bills.
In the past 6 years alone, $1.2 million has been collected by wolf advocacy groups as reimbursement for their legal fees from American taxpayers. Since the inception of the ESA in 1973, this number is estimated by one source to be $4.7 billion. Even if they lose a case, they win. So goes the flood of legal hand-wrenching under the guise of wildlife advocacy.
We have a long history, over a 100-year history of managing resident wildlife, and wolves will do just fine. Hunters deserve to know that Montana's on duty in terms of seeking to manage its own resident wildlife, to include wolves, and to manage wolves similar to other wildlife and in balance with other wildlife. We want our landowners to know that, we want our ranchers to know that, and we want wildlife enthusiasts to know that too.
These legal events under the aegis of the ESA are not only elevating the friction between state and federal wildlife management authorities, it is undermining successful wildlife conservation of all wildlife and pitting people against people when one species is singled out at the expense of others.
Currently, we have significant declines in some historically huge elk herds. The northern Yellowstone herd in 1995, that herd numbered between 18 and 20,000 head. In 2009, that herd was below 5,000 head. You get over into the low units of Idaho, and those elk herds are down over 80% in numbers. And in the Bitterroot, the calf survival or recruitment rates are below 10% as well, and you can't sustain herds at those numbers.
The Bitterroots are in the backyard of Missoula, Montana, where a federal court judge just recently overturned his 2009 decision to delist wolves and place them under state management.
Last August, a federal judge in Missoula denied a request by the plaintiffs for a preliminary injunction. And when he denied that request for the injunction, he ruled that hunting under the regulations established by Montana and Idaho would not hurt the population, thus paving the way for our first fair chase hunting season in 2009. It was a conservative quota that was established in Montana, and 72 wolves were harvested in Montana. 152 were harvested by hunters in the state of Idaho. And hunters really followed all the regulations and did a great job, and really demonstrated that state management can work in the way in which we've designed it and envisioned it. Last August, when that preliminary injunction was denied, it did pave the way for those hunting seasons to move forward in both Montana and Idaho, but it didn't resolve ultimately the litigation itself, the lawsuit challenging that federal delisting decision. The main litigation was still ongoing.
The argument being put forth now by advocacy groups is that wolves were incorrectly delisted because the state of Wyoming does not have an approved management plan, and that they believe 2,000 to 3,000 wolves means sustainability, not 300 or 1,000 or 1,700. It's a non-scientific pick-a-number game tailor-made to keep lawsuits ongoing. Of the 3 wolf reintroduction states, Wyoming maintains that within some areas of the state, wolves are protected. In others, they are considered a shoot-on-sight predator. Animal rights group argued that under the Endangered Species Act law, it's an all-state buy-in or none. A species cannot be delisted on one side of a state line and not on the other, and the judge agreed.
We believe we put some solid legal arguments in front of the judge that would have supported that decision, and that states could be treated separately in that where populations are secure and recovered and there's sound state management on the ground, that decision would have been lawful and consistent with the Federal Endangered Species Act. But clearly the judge did not rule in our favor, and the wolf was relisted August 5th, 2010. For Montana, that's a very, very disappointing outcome. Wolves and grizzly bears and these large predators, there is a place for them on the landscape, but it is a working landscape. You know, this isn't a national park, we live here. And in conjunction with our private landowners and our public lands, we do have a rich heritage of wildlife and wildlife restoration through that hunter conservationist model. Wolves aren't really any different, and they can fit within that model just as well as many, many other species. There's really no precedent for a species under state management of going extinct.
A good question now is, if the Endangered Species Act must acknowledge imaginary state borders on a map, are wolves truly endangered with the amount of them living in Canada and Alaska?
Boone and Crockett Country has been brought to you by Leupold, America's Optics Authority, and the Boone and Crockett Club, fair chase and conservation since 1887.
Be it federal law usurping state law, a scientifically recovered species being allowed to eat livestock growers' profits and the game sportsmen care about, or others allowed to profit from a law intended for the greater good, this is one facet of our wildlife management system that is still broken. The question is how to fix it. The real flaws within the Endangered Species Act are that it is species-based, not ecosystem-based, and its laws mandate recovery and sustainability before a species can be delisted. But the same law does not require delisting when science says recovery and sustainability have been achieved.
The Act is really pretty clear in directing recovery of rare and imperiled species. It's more ambiguous when it comes to the delisting aspect once a species has been recovered and transitioning that management to state fish and wildlife agencies and citizen-based commissions.
In other words, there is no legal finish line or power provided to force delisting. To complicate matters further, wolves are expanding their range into other states outside of the designated recovery states. With no legal provision to delist a species, you have what we have been getting: loopholes opening the door for interpretation and lawsuits. Why should sportsmen care? Even if you do not live in the Rocky Mountain states or upper Midwest where the wolf wars are raging, the game and fish where you live is just as likely to be in the crosshairs of the new paradigm. Preservation, non-use versus conservation, wise use. The Endangered Species Act does not need to be rescinded, but some 30 years later, it clearly needs review, and where necessary, its processes reformed.
Closed captioning provided by the Dallas Safari Club, promoting conservation and ethical hunting worldwide.